just so you know.
Should be up. Should
No.
be up. Yep. Heard myself echoing. I had to mute that.
I know I've got the the little symbols on the bottom aren't popping up for me. I'm trying to get it
Uh-oh.
to pause for everyone who's listening. Hello.
Yeah.
We come on and it's like kind of sudden, and then
Hmm.
all of a sudden because we have the page also open so that we can see the chat and all that kind of stuff on the Twitch. And so it's like we go from just being able to talk to each other. I can't even see Michael when we start because the way the whole system works is we join through Zoom, and he can't have his camera doing two things at once. So I can't even see him. We're chatting. I'm talking into the void, and and then all of a sudden, boom, we pop on, and so that's why in the beginning you hear some, I don't know, weird chatter. I suppose after all this time of doing this, I can't even believe how long we've been doing this. I suppose after all this time, we probably could get into a system of more formality and not saying anything and having it just be this like fancy thing. But I kind of like how it's informal. We're just chatting,
Hmm.
and it kind of just goes along with it just being natural and informal. So
Yeah,
yeah.
I think you have a lot of formal things that you already kind of, deal with on a day-to-day basis. It's probably nice to have a little bit of informal.
Oh, absolutely. I imagine for you too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So how are you doing?
Pretty good. Definitely always feels odd when we have a time change, and so,
Yeah.
which, like, I know there's always been debate on going back and forth, but I think there was actually something recently. I think it was like one of the big like sleep associations that does a lot of research. Essentially came out and said something along the lines that there's a lot of research that shows, moving time forward or back, daylight savings time, actually affects older adults quite a bit in terms of like injuries and things of that nature. And so I was like, oh God, I mean, you would think that if that's the case, and I think they even said a huge portion, well, not a huge portion, but of the ones affected, the huge portion of that have strokes and everything. So I thought that was actually one of those things that you would think that maybe we would probably want to not have daylight saving times anymore.
I know. I think there's all sorts of reasons for it, for not having it. I I I gather there's more reasons not to have it than to have it these days, but um, I don't know. As we've talked about so many times in incorporating digital tools into psychology, is things can be very slow to change.
Yeah, that's true, actually. And I think Ashley actually reminded me of this, but we voted in California to pass like no daylight savings times. I forget how long ago. I do remember after she mentioned it, like voting. Um, but we haven't adopted it because I believe they want it to be where like the entire West Coast is all in unison. Otherwise, it's not going to make sense, where it's like, oh, this state is. That would just be like way too confusing. So
Maybe. I mean, Arizona doesn't
that is true.
do it, and that's adjoining. So I don't
Yeah,
know.
that's a good point. And yeah, I mean, I think someone shocked me one time. I think Russia has like 9 different time zones, something like that. It's
Oh, wow.
yeah, and then another friend of mine in Canada is actually, I think of like time zones. I think of us like on an hour basis. Like, oh, she's an hour ahead. They're two,
Right,
and
but there are half hours out there.
yeah, I was like, wait, what? Like when he told me my time, I was like, I was like, are you okay? Like, what's going on here? And he's like, I'm telling you, like, this is the time. And then I was like, what's going on? And then they told me it was a half hour. I was like, oh my God, this is so bizarre.
Yes. Yeah, there are some places in Australia like that too. And I
Interesting.
imagine other places in the world that don't know about, but yeah, maybe one in the UK. I can't remember, but yeah, there
Wow.
that throws a whole nother curveball into the whole thing because we do tend to think of it in hours. Um, so yes, thrown off by that for sure. I was thinking last night, I'm like, oh, I'm gonna be tired tomorrow. And then I'm like, I think I'm tired. I think I say that every time we're gonna stream that, and And so it started me on this whole path of like, how do I get more sleep on the weekends? I'm not
Mm.
sure. I haven't come up with an answer, but
I feel
trying.
you too. I feel that same way about like being tired, but then I feel like once I actually sit down and like start talking, I'm like, and we finish, I'm like, God, I feel so much better that I did that. Like, especially comparing it to like Saturday, where it's like my routine is basically kind of the same. And once I get up, I'm just like, oh, like I'll sit around, for a bit, like reading something. But once I feel like I get up and have a conversation, I can get moving and going on things. So,
Yep. Yep, I agree. I'm looking at the calendar and I'm looking at our Sundays, and it looks like we just skipped right over, and we would meet the Sunday after Thanksgiving.
yeah,
So that works out well.
yep,
And then the next one I think that's impacted is the 24th, so Christmas Eve. We
yeah.
won't that day, but for people who are listening, looks like we're good until then for
Yeah,
the every up. So that sounds great.
yeah, definitely excited. Also, I forgot to mention, but only something that came up immediately on the day of it. But happy late Veterans Day to anyone that may either be a veteran themselves or have family that's a veteran. And I think our topic today is really good. I know that it's really important to the both of us, and Jess, especially has done a lot of trainings on this. So I think that it's always good to one just revisit, reiterate, talk about things change, but also obviously technology always changes faster than humans, so it's always good to at least understand the core principles and
Mhm.
fundamentals of, as Jess always says, know what you're doing, why you're doing, with digital mediums, because she said earlier before we got on, that the idea that yes, when any technology comes along, it is very exciting. It's exhilarating. Oh gosh, this is so cool. I could use it for this, and we want people to be happy for that, but we also want people to know that it's appropriate, why they're using it, what's the psychological theory and the reason that you're attaching it. Know your client. Things that we'll be getting into further, but more or less just kind of be excited, but take a pause and really think it through to make sure that it's being done correctly and appropriate.
Prior to my foray into all these digital things. So I've been in this field for a little over 30 years. And so earlier on, every time I would hear about a new game, meaning like a board game or a card game, or even a new toy somebody would talk about, or I'd go to a conference and they'd be selling or something like that. I've I've always had the thought that went through my head is that thing can be cool and new and shiny and all the things, but what does it add to my playroom? And if
Right.
it doesn't add something that I can identify, then why would I put it in there? With the caveat that the other side of that is if a client brings something in, and it's the same whether it's digital, traditional, whatever it is, if a client brings something in, I want to understand what that means to them.
Mm-hmm.
It has meaning, or they wouldn't be bringing it into me or talking. When I say bringing it in, I mean either physically bringing the thing in or bringing it in concept and talking with me about it or showing it
Right.
to me on their phone or whatever. And obviously that wasn't happening 30 years ago, but whatever version of that, bringing it in, like they're sharing their interest of this thing with me. And I want to know what that means to them because that's really important information. But as far as me introducing something into my work, I don't know where that came from. I would love to credit wherever, whoever, whatever sparked that in me. I don't remember what it was, but all along I've said, okay, like for instance, when Exploding Kittens kind of burst onto the scene as a card game,
Mm-hmm.
I thought, okay, that's kind of fun and it's different. And then I bought it with the express interest in figuring out what does this contribute to my playroom.
Right.
Uh, and so I quickly discovered that it's pretty much old maid, repurposed, and with more updated artwork concepts, funny things like Taco Cat and all that
Mhm.
kind of stuff. Um, so it's the same thing for digital. And recently, so just in the past, I don't know, week or so, somebody posted, someone who I respect very much, and I think does amazing work, posted a new game on social media and said, and asked the group, what value does this have?
Mm.
Might this have? Uh, and it was VR version of Stranger Things
Oh,
game.
interesting.
And the initial post was like, curious to see how to use this with clients, and then wrote impulse control, decision making, question mark. And I thought that was interesting because nobody responded. and and I expected people to respond, and I kind of stayed quiet on purpose because I don't want to be the one who's always putting in the 2 cents. I want other
Mhm.
people to have space and be able to think it through for themselves and all of that. So I took a while to respond. When I saw nobody was, I thought, okay, I should say something. And I just made a quick list, and I said, critical thinking, personal agency, mastery, multi-sequential tasks, decision
Mhm.
making, spatial memory, self-esteem, trial and error, empowerment, and fun. And the response is like, whoa, people were like, oh, hadn't even thought of those things. And that was, and I feel like I sound like I'm patting myself in the back. That's not my purpose at all. I'm really not doing that.
Mhm.
It's, it was, it was something that impacted me quite a bit because it was a reminder that just because my brain goes to those, I'm so tuned in and cued into these concepts and identifying them in the digital play,
Right.
identifying what the therapeutic constructs are that might be involved in it. And I like instantly go to it, and not everybody does. And
Mhm.
it was a really important reminder for me. Sometimes I think for many of us, I think, I don't know, you can chime in, Michael, but we kind of get into the zone of how we think about it. And it doesn't mean that you're not open to how other people think about it, but it might mean that you don't necessarily recognize that other people's brains might not be doing the same thing as yours is. Does
Mhm.
that make sense?
Oh yeah, it does.
So that's one of the reasons why I was thinking about us talking about this today, and also the example that you brought up, and see if I don't know if you want to share anything about that, but of the discussion that you were having recently and how some of these concepts come up. But it's a good reminder for any of us in any portion of our own fields to say, okay, it's important to revisit the basics, because and that basics word, every there's so many things that are coming out of my mouth today that I'm like, oh, there's a caveat, or oh, there's something else, or I don't like that. The basic word sounds like it has some judgment to it, that it's somehow less than or whatever, but I don't see it that way, and I
Mhm.
hope people who have heard me speak and read my work and whatever know that to me the basics are fundamental.
Mhm.
And I deep dive into as much as I can learn about the fundamentals, because that's the place from which we can spring. That's, if you don't have those, like you were saying earlier, know what you're doing and why you're doing it. If you don't have those thought through for yourself, then to me, you're just kind of blown with the wind a little bit, not
Mhm.
entirely, but to a point, because you don't have a solid foundation from which to then spring. And I think that revisiting that frequently is a cornerstone of our competency,
Hmm.
and that goes into our ethics and everything. So um, I'll stop talking so you can add some sense in there.
No, no, I really liked it. You introduced it very well and put it in a way that I think, does bring the importance out for people to understand. And you're right. I was going to even say, as you're mentioning, to know why you're doing and what you're doing, we can apply that to so many other things too, right? I mean, like, that's oftentimes people that don't know what they're doing or why they're doing in anything in their life could often lead to bad decisions, recklessness, things of that nature. I'm not saying that like therapists are inherently then all of a sudden going to go do harm, but I'm just saying like, you just want to make sure what you're doing is appropriate. As Jess said, make sure it's your competency as well. But um, yeah, no, I agree. And in terms of, the conversation that we were having is, and I thought it was awesome that you thought of this. And I feel like our brains must somehow be linked because this happens every weekend where like one of us will, introduce talking about something and then we're like, oh my god, I was thinking the same thing without us even talking. So it's yeah, but I agree with you. I think that there does seem to be a distinction. And one of the things that I had recently kind of watched is someone who doing some teachings and things of that nature about digital. And I really appreciated, I could see the line that they were taking, um, but I could see that there was still or their strategy really, but only as a mental health therapist could I see that. And that's, trust me, I want to caveat there. I say I'm not bragging, not at all. It's just I think anyone would be able to recognize this as they're sitting there watching another professional do this. Sitting in on training, watching them train people who are not mental health professionals,
Mhm.
but I could see that there was and the person knew the content extremely well, but there seemed to be a disconnect between, um, like you said, immediately going to, what are the fundamentals here? What are the benefits, the goals? How does this help us that you can just easily pull out? And, my brain was immediately going to, yes, there's all these things. And I always jump back between like the parallels and the connections between, what is going on in the game, how is that similar to what I experience in real life or others experience in real life, and then being able to connect that to more of our psychological teachings of what we're trying to help bring to the person. And so I could just see that there seems to be still some work on that front that people are still doing, because in this particular instance the person was speaking about the game and how much they really appreciated it, and how the character in itself had experienced a lot of trauma within the game. um, and I thought was really cool. People could see that and appreciate that, but for me, when I'm doing those kind of things, I'm explaining why, oh, this person is going through this hardship within the game. And very similar if we were to apply this to things that we all go through in life. We've all felt this way, we've all been this way. What are some things that you, and this is obviously an older group, so I say that in a caveat of, I'm not trying to do like, I'm not saying these are children that we're having a full conversation with, but just more of trying to like blend these things together, tie it together, as Jess and I always say, putting it in the language that they understand, not so much of just, here is a game, this is trauma, this is what this person did, and then just move on to the next thing. Like there isn't like this, kind of, what does it mean to you and do you experience? If not, what would you do in that experience? Kind of like as you're mentioning, like let's pull the psychological foundation and the pillars into what we're doing and why we're doing it.
I was looking down because I was taking some notes while you were talking, and I think even in it just, if I were someone who was good at making powerful graphics. I know that I've mentioned probably multiple times before how impressed I am when you're sitting in a training and a great diagram comes up. It's
Mm-hmm.
like, wow, because it a great diagram, graphic, whatever form it's in, takes complex information and puts it in a relatively easily digestible form where you can look
Mm-hmm.
at it, you can see the relationship between things, and the components are all there, and it's not just chaos, it's intentional of how the things are coming together. And so when I say if I were if I had those abilities, I would be thrilled. I don't. I'm not one of those people. My brain is more chaos and all over the place than than a lot of organization. Um, so if I were able to map it out, I know that it would go far out in each direction of the axes.
Mhm.
And so I'm just trying to grab a couple of the key concepts here, but in something that you were saying about talking about these games and all of that, it's like a couple of the layers. We have the narrative layer. We
Mhm.
have whatever, we have the backstory, we have the current story. You have often in games, you have cut scenes that are giving you information about either the characters or the storyline or both or something. And a lot of people skip right through those.
Yeah.
I would recommend as therapists, I mean, if you're just playing it on your own, whatever, do you. But as a therapist, having a different hat on and watching those, because if your client has played the game a lot, it's one of their interests, whatever, they often, not always, but they often will have a sense of what that backstory is.
Mhm.
And just like I've talked about before, me as an angsty teen laying on the floor in the dark room with certain songs playing over and over and over again, because they spoke to me.
Mhm.
Those lyrics spoke to me. And I'm sure everybody has some version of that in their lives, or they listen to it on the car radio or whatever it is, and you're on your Spotify. What are those connections that are being made between those lyrics and that person's viewpoint, perspective, experience, all of that? So in the backstory, the storyline, those narratives, there can be really, really important information. I did a deep dive for something I wrote. I think it was Digital Play Therapy second edition, but I can't remember now. But I did a deep dive into like the backstory of Piggy
Mhm.
on Roblox. And at first glance, Piggy doesn't seem like it has that complex of an anything. You're just
Mhm.
trying not to get infected or trying not to get attacked or something like that. And yet, when you go into the backstory of it, and it's this family, and basically these parents are trying to save their loved ones,
Mhm.
that brings a whole new layer and level of complexity to this game. And your clients just might be very aware. I've had clients who were aware of all the chapters. I'm not seeing that client anymore that I'm thinking of in particular. But at the time, there were 12 chapters to the Piggy story
Hmm.
and knew all of them.
Wow.
And it was really impactful for me to understand how complex their understanding was of it, and then to work to understand why that was meaningful
Mhm.
to that particular client. If I wasn't knowledgeable or aware or even thinking of the idea that there might be a narrative that went along with that, I would have missed a ton of clinical information.
Mhm.
That narrative is phenomenally important. And we talk about that being important in so many other places in therapy. And it's one of those things I was talking about earlier. Like my brain just goes to it, but I don't think a lot of people realize it's even there. And
Mhm.
so um, look it up. Look up what the narrative is to a particular game. And there might not be one, but there might be. So um, the other is like the another layer of the gameplay is what are the interactions with non-player characters, the NPCs? Is it interactions with actual people? Is it multiplayer? Is it single player? And what are those interactions? What's the purpose of them? So if it's an NPC, like, does your client go to all of the NPCs to get, usually they're going to give you some gem. Sometimes they're just, hi, how you doing? Like sometimes it's not any sort of significant interaction, but sometimes it will be a clue or an idea of where you might look for something or someone you should go talk to? Um, is your client someone who is using the resources that are available to them? Is it someone who shies away from even those kinds of interactions? Are they focused on some sort of other goal and they're just, I'm thinking of someone like even in an amusement park or something, that they're so geared toward that one ride or whatever
Hmm.
that they're ignoring everything else that's going on their way, on their path. So what's their approach? And I think that that's very valuable. How they use those interactions. If they're playing multiplayer, are they joining together with other players? Is it a team event? Is it a solo? All the pieces about the interactions. We as play therapists focus on interactions in terms of like even how two puppets are interacting or
Hmm.
different items that might be in a sand tray or in a dollhouse or something like that. We analyze that a lot of times, depending on your theoretical foundation,
Hmm.
to a degree so that we can understand more about that client's worldview. And that's one of the big pieces that I think needs to be brought over
Hmm.
into digital as well, as is the narrative. And then purpose. So what I mean by purpose in this is a little bit of what I was just saying. Like, what's the client's purpose in playing the game, in their approach to the game? Are they trying? I had a client recently who, what game was he playing? It was not Call of Duty, but it was a first person shooter game, a really popular one, and it's just right out of my head. But along the lines of Call of Duty, and there was a certain level of weapon skin
Hmm.
and capability that this client wanted to get all of their weapons to this level. And so the view and the purpose of the play changed because it wasn't strategy per se. There was some strategy in there for sure to meet the goal of the skins, but it wasn't typical play strategy. It was strategy toward this goal. Um, it wasn't interaction of with teammates or anything like that. It was, I have this goal of these skins and I'm just going to go in and meet that. It's kind of like if you're playing something that's not first person shooter, but uh you want to you're playing a game where like the buildings can reach a certain level.
Hmm.
You have to level up the buildings so that they'll give you something. There's some purpose to them being a higher level. And so you go into the game with gathering whatever resources might be needed only to do that thing, not just general gameplay.
Hmm.
And all of those kinds of clues and cues and indicators within the gameplay can tell us a whole lot about our client. Either in that moment that they can be really purpose driven, that if they really put their mind to it, they're going to do whatever they need to and maybe even be hyper focused. And hyper focused isn't always a bad thing.
Right.
We talk about it like it's a bad thing, but I wouldn't get most of my writing done if I couldn't be hyper focused.
Hmm.
You just have to balance that with life and needs of others and your own needs and self-care and all the things, right? It comes down to balance. But I wish we would stop talking about hyperfocus as being a bad thing. It can be an amazing thing. um, it can also be a detriment, so
Hmm.
balance is important. But what's your client's approach within the gameplay? What's the purpose? What's the need? Is it need for interaction and friendship and camaraderie and support and team and all of that? Is it the need to achieve? Is it something that this client is able to do outside of the game, or is it something that happens within the gameplay only?
Hmm.
This means we need to know a good amount about our clients, um, any collateral contact conversations that we can have to say, find out how they are in multiple environments, where they might have difficulties, how we might help them practice that, do some trial and error, all kinds of things. My brain's going in like so many different directions of the things that we can really identify. I'm sure you have some too, so I don't want to take up all the space.
No, I think a lot of the examples that you were giving, especially about the narrative and also just looking at the interactions and the characters, was just spurring all of these memories of clients that I've worked with. And I think definitely the narrative one. I mean, I could share a really powerful kind of story with playing um, Hyrule Warriors. The client that I was working with was really trying to just process some things that had gone on within parental figures and things of that nature. I won't get into it. But the idea is that one of them, they were really struggling with some bad decisions made, and we're playing this game, and I had known the story, and as they're playing through it, they were watching the cutscene, and essentially the villain character is a sister of one of the good characters that you can play, and they have this interaction within a cutscene after you kind of beat the level, and the villain, I should say, is basically coming out and recognizing that something had taken over them and caused them to make bad decisions, and so the sisters essentially reunite. And it was this very powerful moment to watch the client process all of this, because again, if we connect with what they're there in the session with, to process these things, to recognize that you know um, people do make bad decisions, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are all bad, and it was this very powerful moment for the client, and something that I'll always remember. But it was that narrative, that cutscene, as you were mentioning, within the game that provided that. And then the other interaction one, that a lot of them, but one powerful one that came up as you were saying is just working with someone who clearly had to be extremely independent at such a young age, and continuously as we're working together, and playing a game where there's many different routes that you can go. You could go and help this outpost over here, or this one over there, or the boss is at the end, and kind of like the boss. You're the typical way of playing it is you're supposed to kind of handle all the outposts and kind of free your soldiers to help get to the end boss. And the client wanted to go right to the end boss and just kind of skip everything. So I thought that was really interesting. And of course, as we were talking about, I very easily could have stopped and said, "Oh, hey, you need to do this," but I really wanted to see, what is it about this? And because the idea is once you get to there, you can't just beat the boss by itself. You actually need help. You need all of these extra, kind of soldiers. So that's why it's a very task-based game to kind of help the outpost get to the boss. You're weakening his forces, but it was really fascinating to watch the client get directly to the boss. And as far as I am aware, I don't know if the boss is able to be beat at all, doing that. And so I watched the client for, 20 or 30 minutes just continuously fight this thing over and over. And there was a save point. So, of course, they would fail and then go back to the save point, and just keep going and keep going. And, all kinds of things in my head were going off. Do I, try and redirect? Do I, say something? But, I wanted to sit there because I thought this is fascinating to really see. And, obviously, as I'm knowing the client's history and all these things are connecting, and that was what led me to, I want to continue to watch, it became apparent to me that the client needed that ability to probably one, get some frustration and anger out, and then two, also be able to, in a very safe environment, learn that like you can't do everything on your own, and that you can be very powerful, and you are strong enough to make your own decisions, and you have gotten to that point, but it is also okay to ask for help or to realize you can't do everything on your own. And so it was again this powerful moment, and here I am just watching this, like you said, this interaction between the client playing this character against this boss that I knew he wasn't going to be able to beat. And what could I have done differently? Could I have told him like, "Hey, you're not going to beat it. Like, what's that going to do?" And so it took a deep level of understanding, as you're mentioning, from the client's history, what I knew from the client individually, plus other people around the client. Also, our training and our psychological background and putting all of this together. And so it's really fascinating. I don't know. I wanted to ask you this to see if maybe you feel this way, but do you think there's like for some reason, this my brain goes to this, and it's just my own experience, but I feel like in some ways maybe there's a disconnect because I feel most people working with, let's say, puppets, for example, or role playing, they're able to quickly recognize the client's interactions with the puppet or with the therapist's puppet or whichever, or in the role play, whichever they're doing. But for some reason, with a digital character, there's like this disconnect, like to be able to watch their interactions with a digital character. I don't know. It sounds probably weird coming out as we're talking about it, but I feel like there is some huge disconnect because it's just a digital character rather than like a physical
Right.
puppet.
Right. And I think that that's a true statement. Obviously, not for everybody.
Right.
There are people who see it. They don't have to take a course or read a book. They're like, oh, whoa, that's complex. Like that has a lot to it.
Hmm.
I can see that. So certainly, but there seems to be, at least based on my experience on different courses I've taught, on things I see on social media, conversations that I've had. I do think that that is true, and I think we're talking about one facet of it, which is the character, the approach, the interactions, the purpose, the narrative, all the stuff that we've been talking about. We're talking about a piece of that complex graphic, but I think it's representative of so many of them. And for me, I go the other direction and I think this character can be so much more complex. And there are other characters that might have additional pieces of complexities or whatever, or the character might evolve into even
Hmm.
more complexities. It can it can go, it's so much more expandable and potentially customizable than the the traditional toys. That for me, it's like not only is it possible, but it's possible in even bigger, more complex ways.
Hmm.
And so I want to learn more and more and more about that. What might the evolutions be? I mean, that's one of the things that started me on this path in the first place was Pokemon. And not that, I mean, I don't play it. I've dabbled in it here and there. I want to learn, like I said earlier, if it's going to be in my room, I want to learn more about it. So
Hmm.
even when it wasn't digital, it was the cards and old school Pokemon stuff. I I wanted to learn more about it because I wanted to see what the therapeutic components might be and the importance to my clients and all of that. And once I started understanding the evolution of the different characters and the different types of character, all the pieces, it was, my mind was blown because my clients really had opportunities to identify, accept, reject, um, work toward, oh, what are the strengths and weaknesses, what pieces of those are important to them, and all of that translates into the digital realm. I like the example that you were giving, and I'm thinking of this client who like has this agenda to rush toward that boss at the
Hmm.
end, and I'm envisioning it in my mind, and I'm thinking about multiple directions I would want to go in with that. A client would like that, not particularly your client, because I don't know anything about your client, but I'm just thinking in general. Is that, is this their unique approach because of something? It might be their friend or somebody that was important, who is important to them, reached the end boss and they
Hmm.
want to be able to go back and say, oh, I beat it too. Like, is it something interpersonal? Is it more of a theme of, I want, a need to feel powerful and a sense of mastery, because I don't feel those ways in my life because of X, Y, and Z? Is it cathartic where they just need to grind and smash on something in a safe way? Is it their approach in life? Do they, like, if I talked with their teacher, would the teacher be saying they really don't like to do homework, but they love to do timed math papers?
Mhm.
Like, remember those where you'd have like all the math problems and you have to do them all within 3 minutes or whatever it might
Mhm.
be? Like, are they a person who is interested in the end game but not the parts before it? Like, I used to I did ballet for a really really long time in my previous life. uh, and I didn't particularly like class and practice, but I loved performances,
Mhm.
loved them. So I would tolerate the I had ballet 6 days a week,
Wow.
2.5 hours a day. I would tolerate that, not liking it, because I really wanted to do the performances.
Mhm.
In that case, I can't just go show up at a performance and say, let me go. Because that doesn't work. Does this a client who goes straight to the end boss, at some point, do they realize, oh, maybe I need to go level up my weapons or my health points or um, my armor's level, or whatever it might be? Do they realize that somewhere through, or do they just keep on? And if they keep on, why are they keeping on?
Mhm.
If they realize it, what were the components that helped them realize it? Because if this is being mirrored somewhere else in their life as an approach that they take to things, is it working for them?
Mhm.
Like you said, we might point out you could do X, Y, and Z, or you're supposed to do X, Y, and Z, or whatever. um, Maybe that doesn't work for that person, or maybe they didn't know that was needed, or
Mhm.
maybe they didn't understand the value. All of those questions and more are so important for us to think about, so we can understand how is this person going through life, and where are the spots where they're getting hung up, and the vast opportunities in the digital realm for different characters, different narratives, different interactions, different goals that are all possible. We have this really wide array of possibilities for our clients to explore and pursue. And there's so much power in that, to me. And that's one of the places that I get genuinely confused, and not even in a like judgmental kind of way that someone should blah blah blah. It's confusion to me of why wouldn't we include that? Why wouldn't we capitalize on it and take advantage of the possibilities within it? It just I get confused.
uh, you really made me think of something, as well too. And I was trying to go back to, as you always talk, I think about like my experiences and things of that nature, because that's really the only thing I can speak on. I
That is
like to,
not true. Not true at all.
I like to feel like I'm an expert of my own experiences, so that's the easiest for me to talk about. But one thing you said that really stuck out to me as you were mentioning is the ability to customize, and what that information helps us with in terms of a digital character or a digital environment, as opposed to as we say, more of a physical environment. And I really think if I was trying to draw something with a character, like let's say, I use your Pokemon example because I love that as well. Um, and if someone was saying, okay, what like base evolution would you be? And I had to draw it. One, I suck at drawing, so I'm gonna like just be very hesitant about it. Two, I'm probably gonna draw something that's terrible because I'm not good. And then three, so like the best version of what the intent is of the therapist isn't going to come out in me because I'm going to be so discouraged at my own ability. And of course, that says a lot too. So you can learn some information from that. But if there was a digital environment and I can customize these things, by clicking different outfits, clipping different shapes, like the first time I started playing around with vector art, I was like, I remember like going and telling Ashley, like, oh my God, if only I had vector art when I was in art class when I was younger, things would have looked a lot better. So,
Yeah.
but it really did. I actually enjoyed art a lot more when I was able to manipulate shapes based off of math, which is, what vector is. Um, and just the level and the depth of what was coming out through my expression through that, as opposed to if I were to actually even draw it now, was, something that a therapist could probably look at even more. I think one of the things that I'll always remember, this is very early on of you and I knowing each other, but sitting in one of my courses, and it was on psychological testing, and the professor was essentially a psychological testing and assessments, and essentially, we were going through all different kinds and all different ages and whatnot. And so some of the things that I was looking at was, okay, so if I was a therapist and I was administering this to my child self, and it was very much like a Likert scale, checking things off, very typical kind of psychological testing, um, a mental status exam type of stuff. And I said, but if you were to give me this, and so that's when I pulled out and I think you remember when I sent you the video of the one that I made, um,
Yes.
of my, virtual sand tray. And I remember having that in the class as I was doing my presentation and saying, like, so imagine me giving this to myself with this, and you can imagine a child is, probably going to struggle understanding these words, things of that nature. And then imagine me showing you this, and then I showed the presentation. I'm like, which would you prefer, and what do you feel like you could gather more information from? Is overwhelmingly the virtual sand tray, because it was easy, it was intuitive, it was immersive, it was a strong visualization. There's so much rich information for a therapist to look at, even within itself, of different areas. Like, wow, this one is like, there's all these things on fire over here, as opposed to over here is kind of like this, bluish, kind of ocean that you've created. With some flowers near it. And so that's a stark contrast. Like, what is the difference there? And so, as I could just like watch my professor's face, like dropping her jaw to kind of be like, what is this? And so, but it was just that idea of showing people that, like, you can really utilize, as you mentioned, and bring these things in. And if you have that understanding as to why, and knowing what you're doing, why you're doing it, and everything underneath, you can create this like beautiful picture into, I should say, they can create a beautiful picture, and we can take a peek into that, with their guidance, to be able to gain so much more knowledge about them. But I think for themselves, they gain a lot more as well because of that immersiveness and customization as well.
Mhm. Absolutely. And for some, the being able to draw it and having that experience of even I hear a lot of artists even speaking about the feeling of the the
Mm-hmm.
pencil on the paper. Like there's something very visceral for some people. But it's important to have options. It's important to allow people to explore the different avenues in the way that's meaningful to them. And maybe one day it is drawing that Pokemon themselves, and maybe another day it is doing something in the digital realm with it. Just as an example, it made me think of my grandparents on one side of my family. Both of them were artists. They
Mm.
met at the Boston College of Art in the early 1900s. My grandmother was pursued by Walt Disney himself
So cool.
to be an artist for Disney. She had to move and she didn't want to.
Mm.
She was getting married and whatnot, and probably didn't know what Disney was going to turn into.
True.
So she declined.
Dang
Excuse
it,
me.
Grandma. No, I'm just kidding.
I know. Well, I'm going to cough. Hold on.
You're okay.
Um, it's a double-edged sword, right? Because if she had pursued it, then I probably wouldn't be here. So good for me, but maybe not for her. Anyway,
No, I'm sure it was even better for her to do that route.
what that meant for me though growing up was that I had all these very artistic people around me. And now I look back at it and my art came out in a different way. My
Mhm.
artistic side came out in a different way. But at the time, I felt like a failure because I would have something really amazing in my head and then I would try to create it and it never came out the way in my head ever. So I just didn't have the drawing, painting, sculpting abilities that they did. So as you were talking, I was thinking about the times that it did happen, but even just thinking of some hypothetical time that if someone wanted me to do an activity that had to do with drawing, instantly horror inside of me
Mhm.
and not wanting to do it, shame because I couldn't live up to these fantastic artists in my family. And I don't know what's going on with my throat all of a sudden. I'm so
That's
sorry.
okay.
I'm dying over here, but it's okay. We'll finish it. um, and so if I were being assessed, either like psychological testing kind of assessment or even assessed in a therapy session, somebody would probably notice my really strong response to either not wanting to do it at all. I probably wouldn't have refused because I wasn't that kind of a kid, but I would have struggled a lot and I would have been unhappy and I might have even started to cry depending on my state. So there are a lot of things to learn from that.
Mhm.
One of them being a sense of perfectionism that I know that I struggle with. And so there are a lot of things to learn. However, if I had a, the ability to do it in a digital realm, like you're saying, with
Mhm.
a number of different programs, it would have really relaxed so much of that for me. And a person would have gotten a much more valid depiction of whatever it was I was supposed to be creating. Like even if it was something as simple as house tree person
Mhm.
or something like that, I would have been so caught up in the quality, even though we
Yeah.
know as professionals the quality of the drawing. I mean, to a point, if you're 16 and you're drawing a stick figure with three fingers and, you know, like something we might expect from a much, much, much younger child, that we're going to go, what's up with that? Are you being ironic? Are you being lazy? You know, like what's up with that? Or is there really something developmentally going on here that we need to pay attention to? So like it's all information. We need to take it in multiple directions to try to figure out what's actually happening. I know for me when my oldest kids were young and they had to do those poster board projects,
Mhm.
um, for me, understanding and learning about the cricket machines. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Those machines that, you know, you can pump out all different shapes and um, headings for those kinds of boards and like all that. I was so on top of that because for me, the perfectionism in me, it's like, oh, look how nice that looks.
Mhm.
But when I did them when I was a kid and cut them out or drew them or whatever, it was always such a hard thing. Content was easy, the project wasn't a problem, but things not lining up, things not being right as they should be, and having the digital possibilities in that relaxed my perfectionism
Mhm.
to a point where I could feel good about it. Now it was just whether or not I could tape it properly or or something. But my point is that is multi-layered, and one of the parts is that you definitely can learn a lot about people, and sometimes, lots of times, the thing that we see on the surface isn't necessarily the part that we should be focused on. It's what does this mean in their lives and
Mhm.
how where are they getting hung up? And are there other ways to assist them? Or is it something that we need to help them process through, work through, whatnot? And the
Mhm.
digital realm allows us to do that in ways that the traditional cannot necessarily. So
Mhm.
having both available, having the ability to understand your client and seek out more and more information to figure out what it all means to them is is what it's all about as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I think that that's perfect. I know you don't die because I know you said you have a client right now. So you know, but no, I appreciate the conversation. I really enjoyed, as always. But I enjoyed this conversation. I'm sure it'll be something that we'll, continuously revisit, just because I think it's always good. And obviously things change, but also I know that you're continuing to develop a lot of these key concepts for us to be able to follow along on that path, to be able to have something to point to, something that helps us and guides us, especially me being a younger therapist, to be able to have a good role model and someone to follow along in this field. So we definitely appreciate it, and I speak for us being a younger generation.
Well, it's a two-way street. I love learning from you and others as well. So I'm glad that we're all here and we will be back in 2 weeks.
Sounds good. Have a good rest of your Sunday, everyone, and have a good session. Jess, we'll talk again in 2 weeks.
Sounds great.
All right, bye.
Bye.